When the baby boomers are all retired at 65, which will be coming in a few more years, the power is not going to pass to a bunch of 55-year-olds. It's going to take a leap into another kind of vanguard generation.
Hello and welcome back to the Americano Show. I'm delighted to be joined today by Christopher Caldwell, the great Christopher Caldwell, who is a columnist for the Spectator, among other things, and author of many great books. And I recommend that all Americano viewers and listeners read all of Chris's work because it's fascinating. And he has a particularly good column, I'd say, in the latest edition of Spectator World. There's a little bubble here, The Eclipse of the Boomers. And Chris, you've written about how the boomers. I think I'm going to be hostile. I'm going to start hostile, and say that you are a boomer, and your piece, while brilliant, read a bit like a self-hating boomer because you were born at the very end of the boomer generation. So 1962, were you born?
Yes.
Yeah.
Very good.
I've done my research.
Yeah.
And the boomers are 1946 to 1964, and they are very much hated in America today. There's this sort of very selfish generation that kind of wrecked America.
And you're suggesting that the hate now extends to the boomers themselves.
Yeah.
But I would say, I would say that the boomers were never really one generation. What they were was, at least culturally for people, they were the embodiment of post-war youth and optimism. And so when they started being born in 1946, social critics and social analysts were onto this phenomenon almost immediately. And people were obsessed with this new generation of babies in the 1950s. That's why they're called the baby boom and not the teenager boom or the young adult boom. I mean, people were talking about them in the 50s and started building institutions for them and that sort of thing. And I say them and not us because very quickly, these people born in the very first part of the baby boom had conferred on them all the privileges of being, the spokesman of their generation and the representatives of their generation. And that's one of the problems about having been born in the 1950s, or still worse, in the 1960s. So basically, in the mid to late 1960s, sometime between the free speech movement at Berkeley and the Woodstock rock concert. This image of what post-war American youth was got firmly established, and actually its leaders were sort of, crowned. And so basically, when we talk about boomers, we're talking about a bunch of people who were basically in college in the late 60s. And so the rest of us, basically anyone born after, after say 1955, certainly, has very little to do with running that generation. And it was sort of like it was for us kind of like an occupying cultural power, wherever you put us. Those of us born in the early 1960s, wherever you put us in the sort of like demographic sort of, frame.
Well, one of the things you say, well, actually, before we get onto that, I want to just ask you, do you quibble slightly with this trend at the moment for defining things through generations? I appreciate you've done this piece about it, and it's a very good piece, as I say. But there does seem to be this new way of analyzing what's happened in America and what's happened in the West, whatever, through, it's a boomer thing, it's a Zoomer thing, it's a Gen X thing, it's very millennial.
Yes.
It's an interesting way of looking at the world, but it's limited, and it probably makes us think wrongly about things because, as you say, these generations are not that easy to categorize.
Right, and they don't have very sharp borders between them. And when I wrote my book about the book that I wrote about, American history between the assassination of Kennedy and the rise of Trump, the Age of Entitlement, it's called. That book I had really intended to be a study of the baby boom generation in power. It was just not workable that way, and I did it in a different way because these generations do bleed into one another. However, it's really hard to, it's hard to talk about like what America means, and or what a century's worth of history means. We need to deal with things in smaller chunks, and they wind up arbitrary. And one way of doing this is to deal with decades. There's no reason, like, when you talk about the 80s, we got this idea of the 80s. But in fact, 1982 was probably more like the 70s than it was like 1985, and 1989 was probably more like the early 90s than it was like 1985. But it keeps things in the ballpark. And so making allowances for that, I think it's a perfectly okay way to do it. There was a point that I was trying to make in this piece, which is that when the baby boom's influence dies, and that will happen inevitably, it's not going to be passed to the next bunch of people. That is, it's not going to be passed. When the baby boomers are all retired at 65, which will be coming in a few more years, the power is not going to pass to a bunch of 55-year-olds. It's going to take a leap into another kind of vanguard generation. And I didn't say it in this story, but I think that the next kind of vanguard generation, the equivalent of those front end baby boomers, those rule setting baby boomers born in the late 1940s, I think probably the next vanguard generation is going to be the people born in the early 1990s. That is to say, the people who are now in their early 30s, who are the first generation of real digital natives, who were born into this current technological configuration.
Mm.
You know, and in the United States, that's the generation of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Zoran Mamdani, although he wasn't born here, and Charlie Kirk, although he has died. But that generation strikes me as being at the start of some new cultural configuration. Let's say the functional equivalent of like the people who set the tone for the baby boom.
And those people seem to have a particular contempt for the baby boomers. I remember finding it very funny that there's something on the internet called boomer circles, which is where if you're posting a piece online and you want boomers to click on it because they're not as digitally savvy as the younger generation, you put a red circle in the photograph so that the boomers know what to look at. And I always find that quite funny that's how that generation think about the boomers. Is they're like digital dinosaurs. They're bossy, but they're very easy to please if you just give them the right fodder.
Yeah. Well, they're easy to please, and they're not, because Karen, of course, is a boomer.
Yeah, yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, of course, that generation would be hostile to the boomers because that's the generation that they hope to supplant. So naturally, a lot of what they're doing is making the case for the sort of like that the supplanting be done sooner rather than later.
Your book was called The Age of Entitlement, and I think what you're getting at, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that this was the first really spoilt generation.
Yeah, but I think yeah, and that's absolutely right. But I think that it's more of a tragedy than anyone's fault. Like it's not a matter of their parents were spare the rod, spoil the child, or anything like that, or that the boomers were congenitally hedonistic. I don't really believe that. I believe that certain things just arose quite naturally out of the demographic power they had. There were about 75 million baby boomers. Um, in in 1964, when they were all in the electorate and all in the population, the country had about 180 million people in it, or 190 million people in it. So they made up like 40% of the country. you know. And then by the time the boomers were all voting, and that was in the election of 1982, that was the first election in which they were all voting, they were 43% of the voting public. And that meant that, although they had some differences among themselves on anything that they were not united on, they were absolutely invincible because, you'd need 5/6 of the rest of the country to overrule them. And the things that they tended to be united on were the things that were generational. You know what I mean? So quite naturally, in the 80s, the laws were all kind of like, you know, easygoing about sex and, like a lot of like kind of a libertarian paradise, And, in the 90s and in the turn of the century, things were good for like, you know, for workers. It was the job market was highly, like open and now society is sort of like oriented around savings and protecting investment and protecting asset values. And that's just because there's like 40% of the voters are, have generally been in this, in this age group. And now that they're of that age. But what's happening now is that the baby boomers are beginning to die. And there's going to come a moment, they're dying at about 1.8 million people a year now. That's going to accelerate. It's going to peak about 10 years from now. But sometime very soon, although there will still be a lot of baby boomers around, I hope, they're going to fall below a certain threshold where they can call the political tune. And I think that might be well before the next presidential election.
Do you think the Clinton and Bush years were the sort of apex of boomer power? Because I think from what you're saying, the boomers were able to enjoy all the benefits that the left offered, entitlements and so on, while enjoying everything the right brought them, which is the possibility of the free market and making lots of money and getting very rich and saving.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's right. And the thing that is less often remarked upon, but is probably the most justifiable grounds for other generations' contempt, is that they were able to take the resources of other generations and pour them into their own, lifetimes. And I mean, part of this was done by the heavy investment in in education and in the construction of playgrounds and the construction of universities and the broadening out of university places that happened in the 50s and 60s, which poured a lot of the savings of the pre World War II generation into the as it was used as capital for the baby boomers. And then through our tremendous deficit funding, which I think is not unrelated to baby boom power, they've been able to lay claim to the resources of the generations that are just starting off. There's $40 trillion in the United States that is going to have to be paid off by someone, and because it's been used in the last few years by these people who are now saying sayonara suckers, you know what I mean? And I think that that's why you have this attitude among people in their early 30s.
Well, and particularly property, I'd say, would be something that is a massive source of resentment because younger people, you look at the Mamdani election in particular, younger people don't think they've got any stake in the property market, whereas boomers have managed to enjoy it tremendously.
Yeah, and I don't know. I'm not a real estate mogul or magnate or even a particularly competent investor, so I can't tell you what's going to happen. But I would expect that at some point there's going to be a waning, demand for property, and that the property values will soften, and that will probably inflate up the economy to the point where real estate becomes affordable for people again. But people tend to enter the real estate market in a kind of very narrow band in their lives, like actually in their 30s. And if you miss it, you don't really have the chance to use it as a nest egg and the way it's used in the United States and build build a life savings. That's what house has been for most baby boomers.
And I suppose another area that the boomers have been particularly important, for good or for ill, has been, well, probably for ill, actually, mostly for ill, has been immigration. Because, as you suggested, they embrace the, what's going on
I beg your pardon. That was my wife texting me.
there?
Sorry. Wish I could talk
It's a boomer issue, there. But,
that.
sorry, I was saying, when it comes to immigration, because the boomers are probably the first generation ever to be intensely relaxed about mass immigration. And do you think that's connected towards their attitudes towards sex and the family? What explains that?
Not really. I think it's sort of related to this sort of subsidy that they're getting from other generations. I mean, it is another type of subsidy. They've been getting subsidies in time. That is, they've been drawing from the generations before and the generations after, and they've been getting subsidies in space. That is, they've been able to, sort of import the labor market of, our third world neighbors, and sort of get cheap rates on the things they buy. Um, I mean, not everything's related to the baby boom phenomenon. So you might say that our economy is showing some structural weaknesses here that we're trying to prop up by by resorting to immigration. But immigration is a way of of making a funny kind of intergenerational trade. That is, the people who accept the immigration, they get the cheap labor. They draw the benefit out of it. Okay, and and it gets paid for in the form of rights. You have to actually welcome these people eventually into the society, and that's a very awkward sort of it's a very awkward negotiation between the newcomers and the incumbents. And all of that awkward bargaining gets done by people in a later generation, So we had a great in the United States, we had a great wave of immigration between roughly 1880 and 1924. And it was really worked out. That was really worked out during the New Deal. It was worked out in the 1930s by a later generation, and probably it's going to be the same way this time. It's going to be the next generation that has to deal with that.
The generation before the boomers, if I'm right in saying this, is the silent generation.
Yes,
And that is an interesting name for a generation, isn't it?
I know.
But they named that in opposition to the boomers, as in they had some stoic quality that has got lost.
No, I think there were some people um, that for some reason, I think, and it has to do with baby boomer guilt. The baby boomers named their parents the greatest generation,
Yeah.
as if that honorific would sort of like console them for having sort of like had to give so much away to these spoiled baby boomers. Okay. But
Yes.
then they realized that, okay, the greatest generation were the people who had been children in the Depression, had fought the Second World War, and then had spent their, middle years sort of like building all those, nice schoolyards for their children. Okay. But there was this other generation who weren't boomers, but it's like the generation that had fought the Korean War, and they were like a little too young to have been in World War II, and a little too old to have been, marching against Vietnam, and no one really knew who are these people. So what would you call them? They're like the silent generation. It's like they're not really anything. You know what I mean? I mean, it's an interesting time to have been a youth, I think. I mean, it's a kind of an interesting generation, but I think that they were sort of squeezed out of the national story in a way.
Well, Joe Biden was a member of the silent generation, and I sometimes thought that actually explained that could be the only reason anyone ever voted for him, was this idea that he belonged to something greater in the past. Because I mean, clearly his presidency was flawed in many ways.
I think that it helped him a lot that he Joe Biden was never a distinguished or front rank political candidate. He tried to run for president many times and always finished near the bottom of the pack. And that's where he was, like 4 or 5 primaries into the election in 2020 before like a great sort of let's say there was a great collusion between all the other establishment candidates to drop out, right? I mean, Klobuchar and Buttigieg and those people. So he wasn't really looking terribly strong. What Biden did represent, though, was an older version of the Democratic Party. And if you listen to him in 2020, talking about it was like it was almost like a comic routine, like when someone bumbles in. It was like Rip Van Winkle. Okay, I mean he'd sort of like sit around talking to the the United Transgender Alliance for this or that, and he'd say like I know how you feel when you're punching the clock, at 9 a.m. in the morning. It was just like he didn't know who his party was, and I
Yeah.
think that people like sort of preferred the old party culturally to the new party. And so you thought, okay, I'm not voting for the transgender Democratic Party. I'm voting for my father's Democratic Party. The people who would never cross a picket line and that kind of stuff.
Well, that's another irony of boomerism is that it's created a gerontocracy, which is, I think, now finally perhaps dying out. But as you say in your piece, the three tenets of boomerism. One is a veneration of youth. It's like youth is the best part of life. The young are definitely onto something. We need to accommodate the young, even if we don't actually do it. And yet, that generation created this world of Nancy Pelosi's, Joe Biden's, arguably Donald Trump even.
Yeah, and it's what's really strange about them in this stage of their life is they don't really think they're old. It is a funny thing, but you know it is interesting they've stuck together as a generation. They've remained politically powerful, and 1946 turns out to be the only year in American history in which 3 presidents were born. And I really don't think that that's a coincidence. They were uh, uh, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and the current president. So
That's a fascinating fact. And the other two tenets you talk about are well, the first tenet is the main thing that happened in American history is slavery. That's an important part of boomerism. And there's not much difference between men and women.
yeah,
And these are two truths, or established as truths, that have really come under a lot of that being deconstructed quite quickly, I would say.
a little bit. Yeah, we hold these half truths to be self-evident. Yeah, um, yeah, for some reason, I mean, I think that certainly when I wrote my book, I argued that a lot of almost everything politically was understood in light of the civil rights movement, and so these are sort of like any kind of cultural construction was held to be an oppression, whether it was Jim Crow or just the difference between men and women. And people were not very discriminating about fighting discrimination always. But yeah, that's a legacy. I think that that's a central part of the legacy that is coming under question now.
And how much do you think the phenomenon that we're talking about, just talking about boomers, is connected to a strong sense of decline in America?
We seem to have been firing on all cylinders during the baby boom era, um, which is going to make inevitable that there are fewer resources now. I mean, in the middle of the baby boom, right, let's say in the 80s and 90s, baby boomers made up more than half of the workforce. That's incredible that you have like that much concentration of labor power in peacetime, in um, and you had women working, And as I say, you were drawing on the capital of previous and coming generations. And now we're kind of like spent out. Now we're in a sort of like a period of, I think, enforced austerity. And so yeah, there's going to be a sort of like a constricted. There's going to be a sense that the prospects are kind of constricted, and I think that it's really exacerbated by the fact that we've had so few children. I mean that there's a kind of a demographic implosion now that's happening everywhere, and it has reasons other than the generational culture, but that too gives a feeling of real decline.
Well, and lastly, Chris, you cite two examples of sort of peak boomer moments. I think we can call them. One is the Hillary Clinton campaign of 2016, and the other is Neil Young and Joni Mitchell during COVID. I think they told Spotify that they were going to withdraw their music
Hmm.
from Spotify unless Spotify stopped running Joe Rogan, the Joe
Wow.
Rogan podcast, because Joe Rogan was seen to be indulging in kind of counter knowledge when it came to COVID. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, but, I mean, take us through both those. Take us through Hillary Clinton
Well,
first.
well, I mean, Hillary Clinton was the archetypal late 1940s born kind of person. I mean, she really had a great self conception as a feminist. She thought of herself as a woman who is really no different than a man, and you know, I think that people criticized some things that she had said when in the 1992 presidential campaign when her husband was running. People criticized some things she said about motherhood, and she replied, "Well, what do they expect me to do? Stay at home and bake cookies?"
I suppose I could have stayed home and baked cookies and had teas, but what I decided to do was to fulfill my profession, which I entered before my husband was in public life.
Just the blistering contempt for like the way like 90% of Americans sort of thought of their own mothers, I mean, and so that she was really the archetype, and I think that a lot of her problems in the 2016 campaign were the culmination of certain attitudes that kind of went with her generation. That there was like that there was really there was no room for dissent on a lot of important issues, that anyone who didn't agree with her was sort of kind of benighted and backward and low class. I mean, it was very boomer. And then the other thing I mentioned was Neil Young and Joni Mitchell, which is maybe a little bit of a cheap shot because they were both born just before the beginning of the boom, but they're mid 40s, babies from the mid 40s, so they're basically from the same generation as Hillary. And I was just sort of struck by these are two people who were like the perfect examples of youth and freedom, and certainly when I was a teenager, they were like from the previous generation. They were like really important that way. They just sort of breaking away and being your own person, and here they are, sort of saying that they're so outraged by someone on the same sort of like internet platform saying something that they disagree with, that they can't they will refuse to share Spotify with them, and furthermore that they had such a tremendous sort of like misunderstanding of their own power within that medium, that they kind of thought that it was still 1971, and that like Joni Mitchell and Neil Young were like names that were immediately recognizable to people of all generations, but that Joe Rogan was someone that no one had really ever heard of, when you know I mean, you understand, the opposite sort of was the case.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I suppose Neil Young has actually played quite an important role in galvanizing conservative thinking in America because Sweet Home Alabama, which is a great
Oh
American song,
yes, that was a
isn't
that
that
was
composed
written,
in
yeah.
opposition to Neil Young, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Right. It was written in opposition Neil Young's Southern Man, which is,
Yeah.
for a Canadian, I mean, the effrontery of sort of like criticizing the American South. So I suppose he was a symbol in that way. But I've always been very fond of Neil Young
Well,
myself.
me too. And actually, to his credit, I think he acknowledged that "Sweet Home Alabama" was a great song, and they had it right, and he didn't. But
Yeah, I think that maybe they both had it right. I don't, it is maybe a better song than Neil Young's Southern Man, but yeah,
well, to be discussed. We'll do another podcast on Neil Young,
right.
Chris.
Neil Young, beautiful.
Thank you very much for coming on to Americano. It's always great to talk to you.
Thank you, Freddie.